open today's webinar, I'd like to call in the Vice President of the Linguistic Society of the Philippines, Dr. Aldrin Pili, for the opening remarks.
I think Aldrin is not in the room.
I'm sorry, Aldrin Lee, can you hear me? Okay, apologies for that. Okay, Dr. Aldrin Lee is trying to get in. Okay, give me a minute.
I think we can begin the lecture.
Apologies for the delay. Okay, our Vice President is in a commencement exercise at the moment. Okay.
Hello.
I'm so sorry. Again, I'd like to call in the Vice President of the Linguistic Society of the Philippines, Dr. Aldrin Pili from UP Diliman, to give the opening remarks. Dr. Lee?
Hello, magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. Good afternoon, everyone. Mayad nga po. On behalf of the Linguistic Society of the Philippines, on behalf of our President, Dr. Andrew Bernardo, I welcome you all to another webinar hosted by the Linguistic Society of the Philippines in cooperation with the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. We thank Dr. Arian Berlongan for accepting our invitation for him to deliver a lecture today. I'm really glad because Arian decided to introduce a new topic, I believe, a new field that he himself is very passionate about right now in this particular webinar lecture. So as we're still, we're still in the middle of the pandemic. But I see that we have a lot of opportunities, and one of them is actually being able to host or organize talks like this, wherein we could tap experts. Some of them really are busy, like Arian. So we're thankful that you decided to join us this afternoon. So again, welcome, and I hope you learn a lot in this session. Shirley?
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Now, to formally introduce this afternoon's speaker, I call on Dr. Edward J. Mansarate Quinto from the Mapua University to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Quinto.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Dita, and good afternoon to everyone. I am honored to introduce to you our speaker in this afternoon's webinar hosted by the Linguistic Society of the Philippines and the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. Our speaker earned his PhD in Applied Linguistics at age 23 via a competitive accelerated program in De La Salle University, Manila, the Philippines. His dissertation titled A Grammar of the Verb in Philippine English was supervised by Professor Emerita Maria Lourdes Bautista and was recognized as most outstanding dissertation by De La Salle University. At present, he is lecturer in social linguistics at the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, Japan. He was previously with the De La Salle University, Tamagawa University in Japan, and the University of Tokyo in Japan as well. He also held posts at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization's Regional Language Center in Singapore, the University of Freiburg in Germany, the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and Wenzhou Ursuline University of Languages in Kaohsiung, Taiwan. He is fellow of the Royal Society for the Arts. Previously, he was awarded the Brother Andrew Gonzalez FSC Distinguished Professorial Chair in Linguistics and Language Education by the Linguistic Society of the Philippines and De La Salle University in 2019. He is editor of Philippine English, Development, Structure, and Sociology of English in the Philippines, published by Routledge in 2020, which serves as the Handbook of Philippine English and a Festschrift in honor of Professor Bautista. He is director of the Philippine component of the International Corpus of English and is also the compiler of the Philippine parallels to the Brown and the Before Brown corpora and the diachronic corpora of expanding circle Englishes, and the co-compiler to the Malaysian parallel to the Brown corpus. His teaching and research have focused on social linguistics, world Englishes, English linguistics, historical linguistics, and migration linguistics. Personally, having been a friend to Aryan for more than 7 years, I am convinced that his fine achievements at a young age and the person that he is make him indeed one of the most illustrious figures in Philippine linguistics research. Colleagues in the academe, let's give a warm virtual applause to Dr. Aryan Makalinga Borlongan.
Thank you for that introduction. You would have introduced me better than my mother would. I sent in the chat box a handout. I will actually still flash it later, but I sent it because it's not so visible. That thing was not so visible in my actual slide. So I begin my presentation. First of all, again, I'd like to thank the Linguistic Society of the Philippines for hosting this, for organizing this webinar. The Tokyo University of Foreign Studies also, I'd like to especially thank my dean who's in the audience right now, who first of all, he followed up about my presentation, when will this happen, and then advertise it in the university. And then yesterday when we sent out our Zoom invitation, he realized that there were more than more participants and we can accommodate to their initial account. So he expanded the account and then can now accommodate 1,000 people. Thank you very much to all of you. Many people are attending this. I saw the registration list. I know it's not a very good time for us, but thank you for your interest. Thank you for coming here, for taking time to listen to my talk. Just on a short introduction, a more personal introduction, I think most of you have known me to be a descriptive corpus linguist and an English historical linguist in the last 15 years of my life. And I think I was very happy doing that kind of work, counting verbs, making a living out of it. I think I got my job because they were looking for someone who's doing language variation and change. But last year, I received an invitation to work on the language of migrant workers, and that sparked the interest to do something related to what we commonly call in social linguistics. Not really, this is not entirely really new in that sense, but people have called this earlier as language and migration. So today I'd like to reintroduce the research area as migration linguistics. Let me begin. Just a moment. Okay. So the outline of the webinar is as follows. I will begin with an overview of international migration. Of course, define the nature and aims of migration linguistics, the motivations for this kind of study, the concepts and frameworks I'm going to use, some methodologies, and then I also have a focus speaker, my colleague at De La Salle University, who's coming over probably next year, was delayed because of of course, I don't need to say why, the current situation. And then the works of my students in the class today. So that's what I want to show today. Just a moment. Just a moment, sorry. Sorry, something happened. Sorry, I can't control it. I don't know what happened, sorry.
Ariane, you can unshare first if you wish, and then you can come back.
Actually,
you can exit the full screen if you are on full screen.
I cannot even exit the full screen.
Okay. Escape. Press escape.
Yeah, I'm pressing escape. It's not working. Just a moment. Sorry for this. I don't know what
happened. This happens all the time.
You cannot remove my account, right? That account cannot be removed.
Okay, so they want me to remove you first and then you come back? Or?
Yes, I think that's better. Sorry for this.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
Can you move now?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, just a moment. I don't know how it happened.
It happens. Okay, that's okay.
Okay, sure. Okay. Okay, so, and then I'll present the works of my students and the works they did for my class. Sorry, can you stop my share screen again, Dr. Dita? I think there's something wrong with my share screen. Dr. Dita?
Ariane, you are the host. You should be able to do it.
Oh, there, it has stopped. Something is wrong with the PowerPoint. I'll just play it like this without playing the PowerPoint. I think it's more difficult to play. Okay. I'll just share it like this. So migration, I'd like to begin by quoting the former Secretary General of the United Nations. He's a Korean. He was the Secretary General of the United Nations from 2017 to 2016. And he said, migration is an expression of human aspiration for dignity, safety, and a better future. It is part of the social fabric, part of our very makeup as a human family. And I think it's very easy to see how important migration is in the globalizing society nowadays. I'd like to mention, first of all, the founders of the three largest religions of the world were all migrants. Jesus had to escape uh, being killed right after he was born. Muhammad uh, also journeyed from Mecca to Medina, and that journey is now commemorated as a Muslim holiday in the Middle East, Hijrah. It is called. The Buddha also traveled around the center of India for a long time. In the present days, many important political figures um, are migrants or descendants of migrants. Melania Trump, the First Lady of the United States, I think we all know is a migrant. The Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, has Polish ancestry. Pope Francis is an Italian migrant in Argentina. So it's very easy to see many people who are migrants nowadays. Even the Duchess of Sussex is a migrant, and the Duke of Sussex now moved to the United States to be a migrant himself. I present to you some statistics on international migration from the recent World Migration Report, and it's just from the last 20 years, how many migrants have traveled, left their own country. By the way, just to note, for the remainder of the presentation, I think also with the presentations of my colleagues, we will be referring to international migration only. So there's internal migration when you migrate within your country. Of course, it has similarities with international migration, but with, of course, different dynamics. So you see the jump now from 150 million to 270 million, 272 million. That's 3.5% of the global population. Not a lot, but it affects us in so many ways. The number of migrant workers, we don't have data for year 2000, but that's more than half of the 272 million. So these are not the permanent residents or the long-term residents, but these people who come to work. Then you see the importance of their remittances to the global economy, to many national economies like the Philippines. I think 10% of the GDP of the Philippines come from the remittances of OFWs. Refugees also roughly 10% of this total number of migrants. Me being a linguist, a corpus linguist, because I only have data for 2000, I decided to use my own expertise to trace the history of migration by looking at the words migration, migrate, migrant, and refugee in Ngram Viewer. That allows me to check the occurrences of these words from 1800 to now in English textbooks. And here you will see that migration, that all of these words were rather infrequent in the 19th century, and only in the 20th century that it has peaked. And specific points were the word migration, peak in 1920s after the First World War. There was the Great Migration in the United States, so you can see the increase here. After World War II, there was the Holocaust, also the partition of India, and several movements as well. The Potsdam Agreement also contributed to the migration, the biggest migration in Europe here. Here you will see sometime in the 1980s, there is, for a while, the word refugee surpassed the occurrence of the word migrant, probably because of the Vietnam War. Yeah, I have not checked the actual data, but this is from, several millions of words, and it's nice to see this from 1800s to the present years. A little further, we don't have that much book. I think it is good to check on the etymology of the word and where the word migration came. And it basically refers to change of residence or habitat, removal or transit from one locality to another, especially at a distance. Its first attested use is in 1610 for people, and in 1640s for animals. And it's from the Latin migrationem, okay, or a removal, change of abode, a noun of action from past participle stem migrare, okay, and then it probably originally from Proto-Indo-European and also Greek here. It also occurred as a number of animals migrating together in the year 1880. If you look at the etymology of migration, okay, aside from movement, the word move, I'd like to highlight one other important meaning attached to migration in the course of its entry to the English lexicon, the word change. And I think migration studies have been looking at not only movement per se, but its effect, which is change, and movement is the cause, and probably we could refer to change as the effect. And so at this point, to talk about migration, we can see how important it is in the global society. I hope at this point it's clear to us. And so I move on to talking about why a new subfield in linguistics. I think it's a question that you would also ask yourself. I mean, why not stick to migration and language, or language and migration? First of all, going back to the World Migration Report, language is considered one of the most central aspects for migrants' inclusion by both the receiving society and migrants themselves. You know, I'm a migrant myself here in Japan, and I know how important language is, most especially because they don't speak Filipino here, they don't speak Tagalog, and English is not generally used all the time. So I know how important it is to be able to integrate in the society. And the need for us to study or look into how language is affecting migration, that is one major reason why I'm calling attention to this new subfield that I refer to as migration linguistics. Okay, a very prominent applied linguist, Suresh Kanagaraja, who I'm going to show, who edited this volume, entitled The Routledge Handbook of Migration and Language. I think some of the contributors are in the audience now. Dr. Loy Leasing contributed a chapter here. In this actual book, he wrote that applied linguists in diverse parts of the world studying this nexus of migration and language don't necessarily enjoy a shared scholarly identity or disciplinary space. And true enough, you know, when I was beginning to explore this field, I tried to Google, and I realized not only linguists were doing these studies on language and migration. There were economists, anthropologists, psychologists, and so many academics of various persuasions. And I thought it's nice to consolidate the work that they are doing. Even if they are not linguists, they're touching on something very linguistic. Obviously, it's very linguistic because they were talking about language. And that's one of the reasons why I thought it's quite a good idea to propose this new research area. Okay, I use new, which brings me to the next bullet, and I quote, a new subfield of study is also the result of the confluence of other well-established areas of knowledge when existing theories, methods, and systems of thinking are brought together in creative and perhaps unexpected ways to give birth to something distinct and original. This is actually not from a linguist. Legrais is the founder of what they call archetypal cosmology. Okay, and she said this is not something really very new, but she's putting together something most people have previously done before. And I think that's what how most fields begin. Okay, we're also giving it a name somehow to give you a more real world analogy. I remember my boss at the University of Tokyo. I used to commute to that. Now I walk to Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, but at the University of Tokyo, I commute. And I remember my boss said, oh, if you take the train at the same time every day and take the same place in the car, the same door exactly, you will see the same people. And that is probably what this new subfield is. Someone you always see every day, whose name you don't know, whose personality you don't know. But here, when you put a name to it, you give a label to it, you realize it's a whole new different scenario and situation. And that partly motivated me to label this field. As I was saying, it's not entirely new. There were people doing migration and language. I mean, the fact that there's a handbook existing means it exists as a research area. Though I was puzzled, I said, why didn't anyone call attention to a name which could be migration linguistics? And that's what I want to propose. And here, also, I propose a definition of migration linguistics. It's an interdisciplinary, as I have mentioned before, and multidimensional study of the various aspects of language within the dynamic process of human mobility. I think going back to the etymology of migration, we talk about animal migration. There's also, for the computer scientists, they have the migration in data. It is systematic study of migration, focusing on how language affects and likewise is affected by the whole migration process. Ron is a migrationist, and I know they study a whole lot of things: healthcare, marginalization and peripheralization, contributions to economy, identity, and so on and so forth. Here, I focus just on language, but it's never detached from the whole context. You know, in all this time I've been doing linguistics, I was able to detach context. If you're doing corpus linguistics, it's very easy to be out of context, to be just so immersed in the counting of verbs. But now it cannot be like that. It is concerned with how language is used, why language is necessary, and what language represents, and through which language is acquired and learned before, during, and even after migration. We look at the nature of migration linguistics, and I think I'd like to pick 5 words in the definition: interdisciplinarity, multidimensionality, variety, dynamism, and human. And I explained them one by one. Interdisciplinarity, I think I've established that. Of course, this is the study of language. First and foremost, it is linguistics. But also, like computational linguistics, like clinical linguistics, like historical linguistics, and all these other hyphenated disciplines in linguistics, we need to connect to other academic disciplines to be able to understand why this is happening in language in the context of migration. And in doing so, we need to use concepts, frameworks, methodologies in sociology, anthropology, political science, economics, psychology, and education, to mention a few. It's multidimensional because we'd like to look into various aspects and dimensions that's broadly and specifically affecting language in the course of migration. And we also want to speculate how variables interact with one another. Variety, we want to understand language in its different structural levels, the traditional levels in linguistics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and also beyond, and how structure is negotiated with the beyond. Okay, this beyond many factors I was mentioning earlier. Dynamism, I think migration as a process requires looking at the phenomenon as a dynamic entity, moving and changing, going back to the etymology of migration. And so is language moving and changing along the way. It's human, of course. Many people, many of my friends appreciated the work I did, counting, poring over voluminous data in a corpora. But they said, oh, Aryan, how would this impact the real world? And somehow I think migration linguistics is a clear one that it impacts the real world. It is an endeavor to fulfill human aspirations realized through migration and to reimagine and rethink ways to make these aspirations come true. Okay, therefore, I think migration linguistics works on these five strands, or is guided by these five aims. First of all, I think we remain true to being a linguist, being linguistics. We theorize on language as it is used, acquired, and learned in the context of the migration process. We describe the various factors and patterns relating to language within the migration process, how these factors affect how language is changing. To investigate on language in the context of migration using interdisciplinary perspectives and methodologies, I think is very important. Again, borrowing many ideas from other fields, integrating them, consolidating them into this distinct branch of linguistics to provide practical solutions to the issues and problems related to language confronting migrants. I think it's very important because after all, migration is a social phenomenon. It's not an abstract concept. I mean, I was able to be abstract with grammar, but I don't think not with this one. And two, I think very important also to engage various stakeholders of language and migration. That it's not only an academic endeavor, but a social endeavor, a social concern. It's a concern not only for the community of scholars, but also for the community of nations when we're seeing migration more and more these days. I sent you earlier a PDF. This is the PDF file. It's very small. I'd like to talk about the aspects of migration, the linguistic aspects of the migration process. And I divided it into three parts. In pre-migration, the first column, in migration or during migration, and post-migration. For convenience, of course, a lot of people or a lot of migrants probably won't reach post-migration. There are some migrants who won't reach that phase. This is the first box here is the migrant, and this is language, and then everything is covered by the society. Of course, they all interact in the society. Like any model or any framework, this is a broad generalization. It's an attempt to try to cover the major points. It's not a formula for every situation, but I'd like to discuss each strand. First of all, the pre-migration, the migrant, very important is the motivation, not the language motivation, but just the motivation of the migrant for migrating. Is it economic? Is it to work, to study, to join family members abroad? Group and cultural attitudes, how that person is attached to his own country, how he perceives the other country. I know at this time, a lot of people are so interested to come to Japan, and that is a good attitude for migrating to Japan. Probably it will help someone who's migrating to Japan to overcome a lot of differences they might encounter here. Government policies, how the government um, uh, uh, allows people to leave the country, how governments, even the other country, would allow the acceptance of a new person in the country. Abilities and skills. I know some people, they want to migrate, but they don't have the skills that's needed in that country, so it's difficult for them. I remember when I was in college, before I entered college in 2004, the most famous degree was nursing. The aging population in the developed world was becoming more apparent at that time. So everyone wanted to migrate, and then they thought nursing would be a good degree. Socioeconomic status, someone who has the resources would be able to easily migrate. I have friends who migrated to another country simply because they want to live there and they had the resources to do that. Networks also, if you know someone there, you have access to people, then you can easily migrate. Okay. Pre-migration at the level of language, the language ecology. If you're coming from a multilingual ecology in your home country, I think it's easy for you to see another language, to interact with another language. Language policies, the existing policies of the home country will dictate your makeup, which brings us to the mother tongue. Okay, the dialects of the home are the default linguistic makeup of the migrant. Language proficiencies also, it dictates if sometimes language is a requirement to move to another country. Okay, language learning aptitude is also a variable, how you can learn a new language. Language training, if this is available, some people receive training before migrating. Motivations for language learning. If you're motivated, there's the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in language learning. The society, how diverse is the culture you have in your home country, helps you in your migration. You won't be so shocked to see a different culture. The social situation in your home country, what compels you to migrate. The development of the country is one. You see the movement from the developing world to the developed world. That's the trend in migration generally. If you will see the top 10 origin countries and top 10 destination countries. I move on to in migration, identities. Now, identity comes up as a variable. When you're in a different place, you realize you're different. You realize you're someone else. And when you try to speculate on your being someone, you try to recognize, oh, this is my identity, this is me, this is the other. Okay, there's also, I borrowed this term from a PhD student at the University of Hong Kong, a good friend, Nick Ginto, who's doing a lot of studies on Filipino domestic workers. The social the negotiation of belonging. Okay, the social negotiation of belonging. How you negotiate, when in my earlier years in Japan, I tried to negotiate how much of myself am I willing to be to be Japanese in my ways. Okay, group and cultural attitudes. When experienced firsthand positive attitudes towards peoples and cultures, you might probably desire to be in Japan because you're amazed with the culture, but when you see it firsthand, it might be different. You'll never know. I had the pleasure of being here, but you'll never know when someone else. Okay, social integration, social behaviors change. You adjust, you adapt, as I was saying in the identities. Government policies also. How much you can interact, what are the things you do. If the government allows you to work, then you're able to interact with other groups of people. If you're just a student and you're not allowed to work, then you're just limited to school. Other institutions also, volunteer organizations. I think this is the topic that will be tackled by my student later on. Other institutions, the church, and their advocacy for migrants. I know the Catholic Church in Tokyo has a group for migrants. Socioeconomic status also. It will be easier for you to have things here if you're supported well. It wasn't really long-term migration, but when I was visiting researcher in Germany last winter, I was supported by the government of Japan. Then it was easy. I know, I was not worried about what I can or cannot do because I know there's some support, some resources I have. Abilities and skills. Again, as I've mentioned, how your skills, how valued it is in the new country you're in. Social networks. I think a lot of people would try to connect with their own nationality. I want to meet Filipinos when I go to church here. In the Sunday Mass, there are a lot of Filipinos. There would always be a Filipino, even if it's a Japanese Mass. There would always be enclaves of ethnicities. As you can see in Singapore, there's the Lucky Plaza for Filipinos. Length of stay. How long you stay in a country will affect, I'm certain that I have changed the longer I stayed here. I mean, I'm now not reluctant to be here than I was. I know my friends know I was reluctant to stay here. I move on to language and language ecology again. Now the language ecology of the the destination country, the host country, will affect you or the migrant if they're receptive to a new language or they're monolingual. Language policies. This includes provisions for migrants also. Acquisition and learning of new languages and dialects. So, the migrant will acquire a new dialect, a new language, a new dialect if you're moving from UK to US. Influence of previously acquired languages. The traditional construct of an interlanguage, and restructuring of the languages and dialects in the host country when they acquire or adjust to the migrant's language. There is what Peter Auer refers to as long-term dialect accommodation. There can also be long-term language accommodation. I mean, referring to what Howard Giles referred to as accommodation, communication accommodation theory. The influence of host countries' languages on the proficiencies in home country languages and dialects. Sometimes I forget what that word is in my own language because I don't use that term anymore. Okay, of course, your language learning aptitude, how good you are acquiring that language, again in the host country. Language attitudes. Are you how do you feel about the language and the linguistic group speaking that language, which related to language learning, motivations for language learning again. Language training, if there's support. A lot of students, foreign students would usually have language training available for them. Length of stay, how long they stay. I mean, now, even if I don't study, I learn. And it's funny because I attend the professor's meeting in Japanese, and there are a lot of Japanese words, complicated Japanese words that an ordinary Japanese wouldn't know, but I know, even if I don't know Japanese well, simply because I'm exposed to that in the university. So sometimes I know these terms and my students won't know, who are native speakers of Japanese, because I've heard of that, picked that up in the professor's meeting. In the society, again, how diverse the host country is, they will have higher chances of being tolerant with the foreigner. The social situation also, whether there's war or there's social upheaval. I remember Angela Merkel was highly criticized for admitting some refugees recently, around 5 years ago in Germany. The laws for the home country Also, that is a clear the brain drain, which we always refer to, demographic gain for the host country, accommodation of people, not only linguistic accommodation, but now I've seen more and more English signs in Tokyo, and that's partly because of the Tokyo 2020 Olympics. The length of stay also, which changes the society definitely. The longer more migrants stay, the more that the society, the whole society will have to adjust. Post-migration identities. There would have been changes in how the migrants see themselves after the experience brought about by migration. They're different. Looking at the history of English, those who went back to the United States, for example, or the United Kingdom after their stay in the Newfoundland, whether it's the US or Australia or Canada, they have a richer experience than those who were left behind. And sometimes your integration is a problem. You know, I know some people, they can't adjust. They fear going back to the home country because life is never the same again. You know, even if it's a life they know, probably it's a life they don't know how to live anymore. Okay. Language ecology is a different scenario again. Of course, it's a different language. New language proficiencies. You come back with a different set of language skills, whether you acquired it very well or you don't know it very well. Still, you have new linguistic competency with you. Influence of the host country languages, dialects on the proficiencies in home country language. So my language makeup has been changed by my stay here. And language attitudes also will also have to change. How you view your own language, how you view the other language that you recently acquired. And then the society. Okay, while some country recovers the people it has lost previously, they are never the same again. I think I've mentioned this earlier. And the home country would also have to adjust to the return of these migrants from their host countries. Some countries would have a scheme for this. I know there's the Balikbayan scheme for returning migrants in the Philippines, and I'm sure the other top 10 origin countries would also have this. So basically, that's what I have put here. It's not complete, but I tried to cover as much variables, and this is what the kind of variables I wish to see interacting, to speculate on how they interact, how they affect. I allude to what I call successful language acquisition, learning, and use in the migration context. And so I also want to introduce, aside from the term migration linguistics, what I call, we're very familiar with this term, and it's, I also searched etymology. Some books say it was even from 7000 BC that the word migrant, mother tongue has been used. And now I introduce the term migrant tongue, okay? It is the language or dialect migrants acquire or learn in their host country. And because of its prominent use in the society and therefore the language ecology, it may not just be an additional language for some migrants. In some cases, it could even become a dominant language, most especially when acquired or learned early on, or are learned with the positive motivation and are accorded positive attitudes. It may be acquired in the wider community, out of school, informally, most especially younger generation migrants, or learned more formally and systematically in a classroom setting for those who have access to such programs. It is also symbolic of their new identity as migrants, whether voluntary or desired. You know, you cannot, I cannot just go back to the Philippines and say, I will unlearn Japanese. It's with me. And even of their aspirations for the future. I remember when we were interviewing the Filipino domestic workers in Singapore, they somehow tried to copy the Singlish accent, and it's an aspiration to be part of the society. Is not to juxtapose everything, but I mean just to make clear what I'm referring to with migrant tongue. It's acquired and learned at home, in school, at work, in the wider community. Learned sometimes It's consciously acquired in the environment or learned, most especially for first-generation migrants. Family and ethnic identity, that's what the mother tongue represents. The migrant tongue represents a new and hybrid identity, whether you're reluctant or not, it's an identity you carry. And the mother tongue is the language dialect at home, and clearly the language or dialect in the new environment, that's what the migrant tongue is. I was talking about a few studies earlier about, or that is within the realm of language and migration and language in that research area. And I think it's very important to review these methodologies, which have contributed to the study of migration and language. Narratives, very prominent in migration studies. The study to be presented by Ron today is a study using narratives, ethnographies for those doing anthropology, surveys. These are just, this is not even the representative study, this is just what came up when I was searching for a study to refer to this. Policy analysis, econometric modeling. I was surprised to see that there was this paper entitled, which I mentioned here, The Role of Language in Shaping International Migration. I was looking at that and I thought they were linguists, and then they were economists, and then they had this very complicated mathematical formula for measuring how language directs your destination. If your language that you speak or your mother tongue is closely related to the language in the home destination country, then that partly affects how you migrate. Linguistic descriptions, I think it's still very linguistic because it's migration linguistics after all. Experiments, there was one study I was I liked so much when I was doing that work on Filipino domestic workers. He experimented on the effects of Philippine English accent on Hong Kong children. Okay. Also, there's this study. I cannot provide details, but I have a team. Dr. Loy Leasing is there. Lisa Lim, Suresh Karnagaraja is also interested to join us here on this work on migration linguistics. I've begun the work on language programs. We were doing a special training program, special training program for domestic workers in Singapore. They were looking for funding for that. I've begun the work on Migrant Linguistic Index to provide a tool to assess or to measure the propensity of a migrant for a successful language use, acquisition, and learning in the new environment. So basically, this is the work we're doing now, the students' work later on. You will see also. I go back to the concept of migrant tongue, and I'd like to end the first part of this webinar by alluding to a work by a very good friend who's a migrant herself, a fourth-generation Indian migrant in Singapore. She's a professor at the National Institute of Education. She teaches writing, literacy, and literature, but she's also a poet, and she's done, in fact, I think she just released a translation of a historical novel just yesterday or today. But she has a poem which is entitled Mother Tongue. But when you listen to it, also because of her background as a migrant, the migrant ancestry, she talks about mother tongue in a way I'd like to talk about the migrant tongue. She speaks, her home language is Malayalam. It's, I think, the second biggest Indian group in Singapore. But because Singapore have assigned or identified 3 mother tongues in the educational system, which is Tamil, Malay, and Mandarin. Also, Mandarin subsumes all the other Chinese languages. She, in the educational system, she's identified as a Tamil speaker, not a Malayalam. And then there's the English. Remember that Singapore has this English-knowing bilingual bilingualism. So she also speaks English. So I'd like you, so as a close to my presentation, to this part of the webinar, I'd like to, I'll also send the poet, this poem later with the handout, with the slides later at the end of the webinar, but I'd like to let you enjoy something artistic about migrant linguistics. Is a poetry recital by my very good friend, Anita Pillay. So let me begin.
Hi, I'm Dr. Anita Devi Pillay from National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University. Today, I'm going to read to you a poem of mine titled Magta. I speak 3 languages, read in 2 and write in 1. The third, the one I can't read nor write, I quietly cuddle and hold her close. She's my mother. Her name is Malayalam. She resides in my home with my kith and kin. She only speaks behind closed doors, and I don't always understand her. Yet, I look out for her in public spaces, smiling at strangers when I hear that they know her. When I turned 6, Tamil breezed into my life. They said she was my Amma. They said I belonged to her. She was truly easy to love and was always there, sitting side by side 3 others in signboards and forms. Amma still whispers sweet nothings into my ears in my dreams. Then there is English, the language of my thoughts. She was strict and unpredictable, the one I wanted to please the most. She coldly rules my head with an iron fist. Yet, I'm lost without her. It was after all she who cradled me in her arms and held my hand patiently for several months when I first learned to write. Mother tongue.
Okay. Okay, so that's the poem by my good friend Anita. You see how she referred to Malayalam as someone she knows at home, but she can't use outside. She can't talk about outside. And then there's Tamil, which was imposed on her as her mother tongue by the educational system. Someone who she learned to love. And then there's English, who, of course, obviously, as a professor in Singapore, you would understand that is necessary for her job, who hold her tightly as she learned how to read and write. Okay, so those are the things, the interactions of all these languages, of various social factors, when someone moves to another country, when someone uses this migrant tongue. Okay, before I end my part, I again wish to acknowledge the Linguistic Society of the Philippines for their help here, for organizing this, my dean for providing us with this, and my president, Dean Aoyama, and the president Hayashi for providing this account to allow us to have more than 500 people. Dr. Loy Leasing is always there to listen to me for all the things I have in my mind. I always message her, I have an idea, please tell me if it's good. My good friend, Hannah, who joined me in my migration linguistics class, who evaluated my students' papers also. My research assistant, Yusuke, who helped me in some Japanese translations, and also the Center for Multilingual Multicultural Research and Education at the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies for funding this lecture. Thank you very much. So that's just about the first part. Just the first part. I now transition to my colleague, Ron, to present a focus paper on ethno-linguistic bordering. Ron is a migrationist at De La Salle University. He's associate professor and former chair at the International Studies Department, so he's not a linguist. He did his PhD at the Nagoya University on international development, and he's been doing work on migration, on Nikkei Jin, on domestic workers. And he wrote this paper in 2015, and he's still reluctant to accept the fact that I always tell him, oh, it's a migration linguistic topic. And he said, no, no, no. I think he doesn't want to believe. I said, oh, I like it so much because it was so much about language, but it was not written about, it was not written by a linguist. So I bring you to him. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Berlongan. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, it's okay.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen. It's not moving. What's happening?
I think you have to do what I did. You just have to stop the screen share. You have to just play it with, just like we're making the PowerPoint. Yeah. So just share it, but don't play the slide. I don't know why.
Ron, also exit the full screen.
Okay.
Yeah, and then just don't play the slide. Just do what I did. Just do as if you're editing the slide only.
But I have to click share screen, right?
Yes, click share screen still.
Okay.
How about this?
I think you are on presentation mode. Okay.
Yeah.
Is it working?
So I guess it's working.
Yeah. Would you like to move to the next slide? Okay. Or yeah, that great. So you saw the small icon in there. Okay, great. Go.
Great, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. As Professor Arian Berlongan mentioned, my name is Ron Vilog from De La Salle University. I'm actually teaching under the International Studies Department, Japan Studies program. And I've been doing research on Filipino Nikkei Jin and other overseas Filipino workers. So I guess this afternoon I'll be presenting this study entitled On Migration and Ethnic Bordering, the case of Filipino Nikkei Jin. Perhaps my task in this webinar is really to make sense of the principles and some of the issues mentioned by Aryan Sensei a while ago. And also by sharing the narratives of the Nikkei Jin, I think we can somehow steer your curiosity and perhaps motivate you to explore this area of research. So as Aryan Sensei mentioned a while ago, I'm not really a linguist, but I'm very, very excited to work with or collaborate with linguists, because I know that we can make sense of these migrant narratives if we study the language or the languages of the migrants. So again, thank you very much for inviting me to share my research. I'd like to thank the organizers, particularly the Linguistic Society of the Philippines, and of course, Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. So let me begin my presentation on migration and ethnic bordering, the case of Filipino Nikkei Jin. So as a migration scholar from the Philippines, I'd like to emphasize that migration is really a very crucial part of our society. There are approximately 10 million Filipinos who are outside the country. Some are laborers, others are contract workers, others have already changed their citizenship. But most of these OFWs are what we call overseas Filipino workers. We've been sending them to several parts of the world. Actually, we've been sending nurses, seafarers, cooks, engineers, what else? Caregivers, carpenters, domestic helpers. So we're actually catering from the high skilled sector to the low skilled sector of the global labor force or the global labor market. And these OFWs are usually called the Bagong Bayani. We call them the Bagong Bayani here in the Philippines, the new heroes because of their sacrifices for their families, and of course because of their contribution to the Philippine economy, because of the remittances. And one last thing about the OFWs. I think one of the comparative advantages of hiring overseas Filipino workers is really their ability to speak English. So that might actually interest you as students or scholars of language or linguistics. Okay, so my case study is actually, all right, it's the case of the Philippine Nikkei. I'd like to give some context to this case, which I will be discussing. The destination country explored in this study is Japan. And it has been one of the favorite destination countries of Filipinos, not only Filipinos, but I think a lot of Asian migrants are interested to explore Japan as a labor market. But interestingly, in the 1980s, migration from the Philippines to Japan has been highly feminized. So we've noticed, or we've seen the migration or the influx of the so-called entertainers. These entertainers carried OPAs or overseas performing artist visas. And they were able to, of course, to work in the red light districts of Japan. Traditionally in the Philippines, we call them the Japayuki or Japayuki-san, right? So they basically dominated the migration scene or the Philippine migrant community in Japan in the 1980s, 1990s. But things have changed after 2005. So in the post-2005 migration landscape, we've seen a more diverse group or groups of migrants. For instance, there has been an increase in the number of participants of the ITP or Technical Intern Training Program. Although this program has started in 1993, we also noticed the increasing number of English language teachers and assistant language teachers in Japan. Also, we noticed that there are more students and there are more diverse groups of students, not only the Mombusho scholars or Mombuka Gakusho scholars, but we can also notice the increasing number of those privately financed students who are interested to learn Nihongo, but eventually they want to stay in Japan, of course. Okay, and finally, we have a very controversial treaty in sometime in 2006. No? So we have the Japan-Philippine Economic Partnership Agreement, or JPEPA, or now we call it PJPA, or Philippine-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement. And this agreement has paved the way for the entry of Filipino nurses and caregivers to Japan. So I think it's a very interesting and controversial issue in Japan because they are now hiring a lot of caregivers and nurses from the Philippines, from Indonesia, and from Vietnam. And it's basically because of this EPA. And the reason for this is because of their demographic crisis. Okay? Many elderly people or the silvering population of Japan demand more caregivers who will take care of their senior citizens. And lastly, I'd like to focus on this particular group, the Nikkei. So let me talk about this very interesting group of migrants, the Nikkei. Okay, so Nikkei, they are basically the descendants of those Japanese nationals who migrated to several countries before the Second World War. Okay, so the story goes back to the Meiji era. Meiji era is from 1868 to 1912. In the early 1990s, the Meiji government encouraged emigration because of the failure of the agricultural policy in Japan that really caused severe poverty. So many Japanese people during that time were able to go to Brazil or Peru and other Latin American countries. Okay? And there are also those Japanese who were able to go to Northern America. Surprisingly and interestingly, there were there were Japanese who actually explored the opportunity here in the Philippines. Most of them worked in northern Philippines through an American construction project that's the Benguet Road or the Cannon Road. Okay, that particular road leading to Baguio, the summer capital of the Philippines. Okay, so a lot of Japanese to contributed to the construction of that road, and then um, some of these Japanese stayed in the Philippines. They remigrated to southern Philippines, for the plantation, for the agricultural plantation. Okay, so in other words, these Japanese or the descendants of these Japanese who migrated to the Philippines before and during the Second World War are the Nikkei. Okay, so they are basically co-ethnics of the Nikkei of the Japanese, and because they are considered as partially Japanese, the Japanese government has given them the opportunity to return to Japan as returned migrants. So there is a particular law in the 1990s that says that they can return to Japan and work without restriction. So a lot of these Brazilian Japanese, Peruvian Japanese, and even Philippine Cajun were able to explore this opportunity. So they were already there in Japan. Okay, so these are the Nikkei. Okay. It's a very interesting, I think it's a very interesting case study because as Professor Arian Berlongan mentioned, the dynamics of identity decentering, okay, the dynamics of identity fragmentation is very, very evident for the Nikkei because they're not only Japanese, they're not only Filipinos, they're also Nikkei, and they have a lot of identity fragmentation issues that will later on affect their linguistic resources. So these are some of the research questions that I would like to explore. Or I'm going to perhaps focus on the first one. How do Philippine Cajun assert and modify their identities, particularly their ethnic identities during the experience of migration to their ancestral homeland? And I'm referring to Japan as the ancestral homeland. And why does this bordering occur? What are the reasons? What are the factors? In addressing these questions, I was able to interview more than 50 Nikkei sometime in 2014, 2015. But recently, I was able to start another project about the Nikkei. So I've been increasing the narratives of the Nikkei. But now, I've been focusing on the returnees. So in other words, those Nikkei who were able to work in Japan, but they are now here in the Philippines. They have already returned or repatriated to the Philippines. All right, so that is basically my question and methodology. When we take a closer look at the narratives of the Nikkei, I think we will notice that they're still engaging in this framework of politics of recognition. Politics of recognition has been a very interesting issue tackled by Professor Shun Ono. Basically, they were still struggling for recognition because many of them do not possess documents to prove that they are Nikkei. So in other words, they have not yet proved or they have not yet acquired the Nikkei visa, but they are by blood Nikkei. Okay, so that's the politics of recognition. On the other hand, there are also those who were able to get, or who were able to obtain the Nikkei visa, but until now they still feel somehow marginalized or discriminated. And of course, one of the reasons for this is it's basically because most of them are working in Japanese factories. So in other words, they are part of the flexible, disposable labor of Japan. And you might be wondering about their situation nowadays because of the pandemic. They are really, really affected by the closure of many industries in Japan. Okay. The case of Filipino Nikkei, let me just check the time. Okay, the case of the Philippine Nikkei highlights ethno-linguistic issues that and even the politics of languages provoked by their complex identities. So if you can read these narratives, some of the quotations from the stories of the Nikkei, they are trying their best to really assert their identity. They're trying to narrate, how they are related to Japanese immigrants. So they're saying that they have Japanese blood, that their grandfather is Japanese. They should be treated better. They are not fake Nikkei, or they are not even Japayuki, and so on and so forth. So in other words, these narratives tell us that moral-based or morality-based othering has manifested in such identity assertion. Okay, so what do I mean when I say moral-based othering or morality-based othering? I think their narratives tell us that they are really different from other Filipinos. So if you will be looking at the interview transcript, they are really asserting their Nikkei-ness, or should we say Japanese-ness, okay? And they were saying that they are different from those Filipinos who have negative images, or who have negative reputation in Japanese society. For example, the Japayuki, or the Japayuki-san, and they're also saying that they are different from those who are considered as bilog or overstayers, and they are also different from the fake Nikkei, the peke-jin, okay, the fake Nikkei. And when they do this assertion, they always refer to their good educational background, decent family background, and they also talk about their linguistic resources. Like they say that they are better Japanese language speakers as compared to the Japayuki. They are better English language speakers, and so on and so forth. Okay, so okay. So what I really want to argue in this study is what I want to argue, and what I really want to share to you, as you guys are scholars of languages and linguistics, is the interesting phenomenon of bordering, which is very relevant to how they negotiate their identity. And as mentioned a while ago, this negotiation of identity also affects the negotiation of their linguistic repertoire. First, they reveal their multiple identities and situational identities. What do I mean by multiple identities? If you will be analyzing the transcript of their interviews, there are times when they are really referring to themselves as Japanese Filipino. Sometimes they assert their Filipino-ness. They're saying that they are very Filipino, Pinoy na Pinoy. But sometimes they're also saying that they are Nikkei. Okay, and most of the time they are saying, or there are certain times when they are inside their kaisha or their workplace, when they affiliate themselves with their ethno-linguistic grouping. Okay, so this is very interesting in a sense that they have been embracing several identities as a Filipino Nikkei. But at the same time, I'd like to argue that this is a case of situational identity. Situational in the sense that they assert a particular identity that would somehow empower them that would give them more power, that would give them more resources. Okay, so for instance, if they really want to if they really want assert their rights as a Japanese, they would actually mention that they are very Japanese, that they have the Japanese blood, right? But if they are in, for example, in their religious institutions or church, and they really want to gain more friends or to have more friends in the Filipino community, they would assert their Filipino identity. So I guess this is a case of situational identity. Ethno-linguistic boundaries are forged by mutual feelings of commonality and rivalry with other groups. Rivalry has been rooted in cultural stereotyping that has been a common mark of national diversity. So as I will be explaining later, these can even trigger some clashes among regional groupings. For example, this is already an old story for us, right? The clashes among these groupings: Tagalog, Bisaya, Ilocano. Most of you, I think, for most of you from the Philippines, I'm sure that you've heard about these ethno-linguistic clashes, right? These are not new. You've seen this, you've heard about this, and you've probably studied this, right? But these clashes, interestingly, these clashes are not only triggered by their ethno-linguistic sentiments. My argument here is that these clashes are actually fueled by factory politics or the Kaisha politics. So it's very evident that there is this dynamics of exclusionary closure. When we say exclusionary closure, this is the attempt of one group, in this case an ethno-linguistic group, to secure for itself a privileged position at the expense of another group. Okay? So language becomes really a basis for forging social networks. Given that socio-political dynamics, I think language has become a very important issue in this dynamics of Nikkei migration. Okay, for one thing, it has become a basis of solidarity, in which is Bisaya people, for example, and Tagalog people, or people from the north would form their own exclusive group and sometimes will rival another group. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that language here has become a resource of group belongingness and even security. Okay? And for another thing, they use language to affirm their privileges and power. According to the narratives, there's even a debate about who's better English speaker, because for them that signifies their education and social class. So let me just focus on some of the narratives. I'm not going to read everything because this will take a lot of time, and I think I have very limited time now. All right. So Sharon from Mindanao is a Nikkei, and she was saying that they are considered as as Nikkei from Mindanao. They're considered as people from the mountains. And somebody from General Santos City was also saying that her Bisayan access was an object of ridicule. So from General Santos again, she was saying that we are from Mindanao, and people they think that people from Mindanao are very poor, but actually there are millionaires from Mindanao, like Manny Pacquiao. And another narrative here from Quezon City, she said that she felt offended when they call her the Tagalog lady, and she thought that a lot of people surrounding her were gossiping about her. Okay, so basically these are some of the narratives that I wanted to share. Filipino Nikkei workers employed various strategies to obtain or maintain their access to the resources at the expense of marginalizing other migrant workers. This struggle has been demonstrated by the politics of recognition and difference, which seemingly reproduce discrimination against other Filipino migrants or the out-group while prompting empowerment among the in-group. So, for the last part, just some reflections about how we can make sense of these ethnic bordering and ethno-linguistic boundaries and somehow translate it to the issue of migration linguistics. I think the phenomenon of ethno-linguistic bordering has become very salient during the migrant experiences of Filipino Nikkei. So as Professor Arian Borlonga mentioned a while ago, the experience of dislocation has really triggered um, um, uh, the process of identity fragmentation and identity decentering, and these processes would also affect the way they negotiate their identities, and this would also affect the way they forge solidarity among their comrades and co-ethnics, and that would of course translate to how they communicate with one another. In other words, that is also an issue of linguistics. Ethno-linguistic boundaries are forged by mutual feelings of commonality and rivalry. The causes are multifaceted, as I've mentioned a while ago: stereotyping, language barrier, socioeconomic status, and so on and so forth. Finally, I'd like to mention that this encounter with various groups of different linguistic and cultural background pushes the Nikkei to belong to a particular group, and the most probable membership is the regional origin of the migrant. Hence, the cultural nuances of regionalism in the Philippines are transmitted to the Nikkei migrants in Japan, leading to recollection of stereotyping against rival ethno-linguistic groups. And finally, okay, I'd like to mention this theory, and perhaps this is something relevant also to the concept of identity decentering from Professor Takeyuki Tsuda, when he was saying that sometimes migration can lead to deterritorialized nationalism. Okay, so in other words, when we migrate, there is always a tendency for us to increase our level of nationalism, right? And that has been proven for other groups, like for example, for the Brazilian Nikkei. When they when they were in Brazil, they thought that they were very Japanese. But when they already arrived in Japan and they experienced these kinds of discrimination, marginalization, then suddenly their identity changed, and that is Professor Suda mentioned that is the process of identity decentering. Okay? And there has been some performance of counter identities. For example, you might be interested in taking a look at this research, because this is something related also to linguistics. He was saying that when they were already in Japan, these Japanese Brazilians tend to perform their Brazilianness. And how do they do that? By speaking Brazilian and by really convincing their audience, or convincing the people that they are solid Brazilians. Okay, and they have also organized a lot of projects and programs for the Brazilian community. So that's how they perform their deterritorialized nationalism. Okay, so in the case of the Philippines, it's also the same thing. There has been some solidification of national identity, but I think it's more of fragmentation and layering of identities. And in this case, it can be very regionalistic and self-critical to its moralistic assertions. So again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share this research. We can further discuss later.
Thank you, Dr. Vilog. Aryan?
Okay, so I will now give some time to my students I asked them for 10 minutes just to present their simple projects in my class. Also, it's so nice that the makeup of my class were almost all of us are migrants. So I'd like to begin with Subila. She is from Zambia. She's studying in Tokyo, Japanese language education. So she'll talk about accommodation strategies of Zambians to Chinese migrants in uh, in Zambia. Yes. Subila, please begin.
Thank you. Just a minute, let me share my screen. Okay. Good day to you all. I would like to first thank Tokyo University of Foreign Studies and the Linguistics Society of the Philippines for this amazing opportunity. And my name is Subila Chulupula, as Professor Borlongan had said. I'm a master's student at Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, and my interests are linguistics and foreign language education. Now, my topic is language accommodation strategies of the host society to the new migrants, a case study of Chinese workers in Zambia. So what then is language accommodation? By definition in linguistics, accommodation is the process by which participants in a conversation adjust their accent, diction, or other aspects of language according to the speech style of the other participant. Some synonyms of language accommodation are linguistic accommodation, speech accommodation, and communication accommodation. Now, accommodation is usually considered to be between the message sender and the message receiver, but the communicator also often accommodates to a larger audience, as in this case right now as I'm speaking to you, either a group of people that are watching the interaction or society in general. My research was based on the communication accommodation theory. This theory was developed by Howard Giles in 1973. And the basis of this theory basically lies in the idea that people adjust or accommodate their style of speech to one another. The theory concerns the behavioral changes that people make to attune their communication to the person or people being spoken to. Just like in the definition I had given earlier, people change their diction, their accent, and also use gestures. Now, doing this helps the message sender gain approval from the receiver, and it increases efficiency in communication between both parties and helps the sender maintain a positive social identity. The theory is also concerned with links between language, context, and identity, meaning this theory is both social linguistic and psychological. Now, in communication accommodation, there are two main concepts. We have convergence and divergence, and I will now explain these two. These are linguistic strategies used by interlocutors, and they denote the general directions in which accommodation can take place in a speech situation. Convergence, by definition, is a speaker's modification of speech in order to sound more like the person being spoken to, in order to achieve greater social integration with them. Divergence, on the other hand, is deliberate linguistic differences employed by a group as a symbolic act for asserting or maintaining their distinct identity, just like the previous presentation where identity was mentioned. That is mostly divergence. Now, the research questions that I was hoping to answer in my research were, firstly, what language accommodation strategies do Zambians use when speaking to Chinese migrants? And secondly, which of the two between convergence or divergence is more common? I will now proceed to give you a brief background of Chinese immigrants in Zambia. Recently, the number of Chinese migrant workers has increased in a number of African countries. China and Africa have been partnering on investments for approximately the last 11 years. Zambia, a country in the central southern part of Africa, is no exception to this partnering, as in the past years, the Chinese government has set up companies in Zambia, including a Confucius Institute at the University of Zambia, providing Chinese language studies for students who would like to major in Chinese linguistics and later, on scholarship, obtain a master's degree in China. In recent decades, the population of Chinese people in Zambia has rapidly increased, and there were 80,000 Chinese people living in Zambia, according to a 2019 UN World Population Study. I will now proceed to discuss what method I used during my research. The subjects were Zambians aged between 30 and 45, mostly working in the engineering industry under Chinese companies. And these had an education background of at least secondary school. And Chinese immigrants aged between 30 and 45, also working in the engineering sector and business sector. The data included recordings of conversations and videos posted on Facebook. And the total length of all the recordings combined was about 2 hours long. After collecting these recordings and Facebook videos, I then transcribed them and analyzed the data in order to find what accommodation strategies that Zambians use with Chinese migrant workers. The findings were as follows. The most prominent accommodation strategy was accent mobility. Secondly, the use of simplified terms. Thirdly, reduplication, and use of the base form of the verb, and finally, foreigner talk or baby talk. I will start by defining and explaining accent mobility. The term accent mobility was first coined by Howard Giles in 1973 as the ability of an individual to modify his accent or pronunciation. Accent mobility happens both consciously and unconsciously. It is one of the commonest accommodation strategies used. In the following video, a Zambian citizen, while speaking to a Chinese migrant worker at an accident scene, is heard changing his accent in order to sound more like that of the Chinese migrant with the hope of being understood better. Now, before I play the video, I'd like you to pay attention to the way the Zambian citizen tries to mimic the way the Chinese migrant speaks English.
Anazaka, kama, want to tana, you turn here, corner. Now this China car, kama. Now want to do that. No, China car behind. Behind. Then another car in front. In front, make a U-turn. Oh, out the turn. So China, like what's no car, come like this. Starter.
Okay, so in the previous video, if you noticed, the Zambian speaker kept adding the R tone sound in words like turn, he would say tana, and come, he would say kama. And when you listen to a Chinese migrant with little to no English, you would actually notice that this is the way in which they speak English. And so Zambians tend to mimic this accent in order to communicate better with Chinese migrants. Secondly, I will define the use of simplified terms. Now, depending on the audience of the speaker, diction is modified. This is seen in conversations between a doctor and a patient, a lawyer and a client. A doctor will not use medical jargon when speaking to his patient. He will, however, try to use the simplest terms possible. Now, this phenomena was witnessed in most of the recordings as Zambians tended to look for simpler synonyms to words that were not understood by the Chinese migrants. It should be noted that when a simplified term isn't understood, the speaker would instead try to describe the word and incorporate gestures. The third accommodation strategy I would like to explain is reduplication. In linguistics, reduplication is a morphological process in which the root or stem of a word, or part of it, or even the whole word is repeated exactly or with a slight change. Now, in my research, I focused on whole word reduplication. And here's an excerpt from one conversation. Now, initially, the Zambian citizen was speaking standard English and said, "Where is your boss?" But the Chinese migrant said, "No, understand," to mean "I do not understand." And immediately you see the Zambian changing his diction and sounding more like the Chinese migrant. And he says, "Oh, English no understand," to mean, "Oh, you do not understand English." And the Chinese then replies, "English small, small," to mean, "I only understand a little bit of English." I would like you to pay attention to the sentence "English small, small," in which the Chinese migrant reduplicates the word small twice. And in the next sentence, the Zambian also reduplicates the same word and said, "Okay, I speak small, small," to mean, "Okay, then I will speak simple English." This is one of the examples of reduplication in my research. I'll now move on to the fourth accommodation strategy, which is the use of the base form of the verb. And in English grammar, the base form of a verb is its simplest form. These exist without a special ending or a suffix on their own, but can be changed and added onto to fit different uses and tenses. A verb's base form is what appears in dictionary entries. Now, the English language has several irregular verbs such as go, buy, speak, etc., of which the past tense form deviates from the simple ed form. For example, for regular verbs like talk, you'd simply have talked. However, for irregular verbs like to go, you'd have went, which deviates completely from the base form. Now, in this case, during accommodation, the speaker tends to use the infinitive or the base of such verbs. And here's another example from an excerpt. Yesterday, I spoke to your boss, and yesterday, I speak to your boss. So the sentence initially, the correct form was supposed to be yesterday, I spoke to your boss. Spoke being the past tense of the verb to speak. However, to accommodate the migrant, the Zambian citizen said, yesterday I speak to your boss. And finally, I will look at foreigner talk, also sometimes likened to baby talk. The term foreigner talk was coined in 1971 by Stanford University professor Charles A. Ferguson, one of the founders of social linguistics. When addressing a listener not skilled in the speaker's language, people may simplify their spoken language in an attempt to improve understanding. This is sometimes likened to baby talk, as the speaker uses a baby talk-like language to communicate, skipping out small words and possibly using demonstratives instead of pronouns. For example, as opposed to saying, "Do not cross the road," you say, "No cross road." And I'll go back to the initial excerpt I had used from the conversation where the Chinese migrant says, "No understand," instead of "I do not understand." And the Zambian citizen using foreigner talk also says, "Oh, English no understand," to mean, "Oh, you do not understand English." It is worth noting that sometimes foreigners take offense when foreign talk is used, especially when they feel that they have put in effort in trying to learn and understand the host country's language. Now, in my findings, previous studies have shown that it is more common for a foreigner to try and change their speech in order to be accepted by that society as opposed to the society accommodating the foreigner. For example, when I came to Japan, I automatically realized that I should possibly strive to learn the language, to try and speak and behave like Japanese people in order for me to be accepted into this society. However, in this study, the findings show that Zambians go out of their way to accommodate migrant Chinese workers using the previously mentioned strategies. It should be noted that in one video, divergence occurred during the conversations as a government official was speaking to a Chinese migrant worker who had missing necessary documents for his business. In order to assert dominance, superiority, the government official spoke standard English and used legal technical terms. Sometimes we see this in the classroom scenario when you as a professor would want to assert dominance or superiority. The way in which you speak to your students automatically changes. And this is no longer convergence, this now becomes divergence as you're trying to exclude the students from your in-group as a professor. Now, as I conclude, I'd like to conclude my presentation with a question for possible for the research, as this is an ongoing study. Now, the foreigner talk hypothesis argues that a Pidgin or Creole language forms when native speakers attempt to simplify their language in order to address speakers who do not know their language at all. Now, with this in mind, is it possible that as a permanent result of language accommodation between Zambians and Chinese migrants, a Pidgin might eventually form? And with this, I will end my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I thank you very much, Subila. I move on to the next presenter. He is a Eurasian, and he is studying here in Japan. So he's my other students talking about linguistic integration of Chinese migrants in Japan. Yes, Takatsuki, please begin your presentation.
Marian?
Just a moment. I'm just looking. He disappeared in the group. Takatsuki. Suddenly he's out. Okay, probably I'll move. I'll begin with Takahiro first. Hero. Oh, there. Sorry, there's Takatsuki. Takatsuki, you're back. Wait, he disappeared because sorry. Okay, Takatsuki.
Sorry for
Yeah. Okay.
problem.
Okay, sure. You can begin now.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Takatsuki from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. I will talk about the language maintenance in relation to the identity of Chinese immigrants in Japan. One of the most popular migration places for Chinese migrants is the United States of America. There are many scholars and references to be finding to know the moment of Chinese migrants, like Golden Chance Chinese, American Voices, from the gold rush to the present. So when I read this book, it made me wonder what about the Chinese migrants in Japan. This is so motivated me to do some research on Chinese-Japanese voices as well. Now I will give a background of the Chinese migrants for the past 3 decades. Japan has been one of the main destinations for Chinese migrants and expatriates. In 1918, the Chinese population in Japan was just over 50,000. In 2007, the Chinese surpassed the Koreans, who are often able to obtain Japanese citizenship, as the largest group of foreign residents in Japan. Then in 2019, the Chinese population, including those who are already naturalized Japanese citizens living in Japan, totaled to 960,000. The purpose of the study is to investigate the Chinese migrants' acquisition of Japanese as their second language, particularly those who came to Japan at an early age, 18 years old and below, or those born in Japan but received education both in China and Japan, and how it affects the maintenance of their first language, Chinese, and identity. The data gathering method which was used for this research is interview. The respondents were interviewed individually and were asked questions regarding second language acquisition vis-a-vis the first language maintenance and loss. The respondents are all under 30 years old. All but one completed university education, and others are graduate school students, businessmen, consultant, English teacher, and a real estate agent. The result of the study showed that there are commonalities among the respondents. All of them feel that it is necessary to have institutional support during this period that they study the Japanese languages as second language, which most of them received. The support from the government, NGOs, or public school greatly helped them in second language acquisition. Usually, the specialized Japanese language teacher was offered to public school by government and NGOs. Meanwhile, private schools offered individual lessons for Japanese learning, which is quite surprising, as a form of institutional support, and they also offer some life and career counseling. In terms of the mother tongue, at first, all of the respondents told me their mother tongue is Chinese, but the most interesting part is the more I talk with them, they began to get confused about their mother tongue, which leads them to respond that their mother tongue is Chinese and or Japanese. Since most of them speak Japanese only in school, it is interesting to know how they maintain their mother tongue proficiency. They speak Chinese and Japanese at home, access the SNS, news, and related information in Chinese, and continuously connect with the Chinese community in Japan. However, it made me wonder, despite their efforts to maintain their mother tongue proficiency, is there any possibility for them to forget their primary language? The answer is yes. This phenomenon is called language attrition. Most of the respondents have experienced language attrition. The level of attrition varies from person to person and is highly related to the period of time they acquire the second language. That is, the early they acquire the second language, the higher the attrition rate happens because they use the second language for the most part of their life. The example especially is the second generation migrants. As it regards identity, all of the respondents recognize themselves as having a bicultural identity. Cultural perspective influences the individuals, for example, life experiences in their way of thinking, and that is why they consciously and unconsciously face situations when cultural differences become apparent. They eventually learn how to deal with the situation automatically. One of the most interesting results of the interview is that I discovered the differences among the respondents as regards the level of the four language macro skills in using Chinese and Japanese. The result was totally different self-recognition of the language proficiency in terms of four macro skills of languages, but most of them explicitly tell that writing skill highly relies on the amount of education received. As regards comprehension, most of the first generation tend to perceive the Chinese in Chinese, Japanese in Chinese, and second generation tend to think or perceive their thoughts in mixed Chinese, Japanese, or perceive Chinese in Chinese and Japanese in Japanese separately. However, the first generation who come to receive the primary, secondary education cannot tell which language they use for thought processes. Also, most of them also reported that they think in mixed Chinese, Japanese for the academic learning in university as well. In conclusion, migrants naturally try to maintain their mother tongue with the family connection or the family environment. The connection with their ethno-linguistic communities play a very important role for the individual to maintain their languages. The language attrition has a high possibility of happening at a serious level once they cannot find enough reasons to maintain their mother tongue. And in Japan, linguistic integration is positive rather than expected, even though they had difficulties gaining the second language at first. In the end, the second language plays a significant role in their lives, which contributes to their efforts to blend in the Japanese society now. That is why acquiring the official language of the host society is the inevitable step to be integrated. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you. And now I ask your patience for the last speaker because I know we're a bit over time. I think we will finish at 6:10 or 6:15 Tokyo time, 5:10 or 5:15 Manila time. I now move on to my student, my Japanese student, my lone Japanese student in the class. He studied Russian for his undergraduate, and now he's going to talk about Russian and Russian language schools in Moscow for the migrant children in Moscow. Yes, Takahiro.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Takahiro, and I'll talk about, sorry, just a minute.
Better not to play the slide because sometimes it's problematic. Just, okay, that's fine.
Okay. Yes, just a moment. I talk about government and volunteer support for the linguistic integration of migrant children in Moscow. The Russian Federation was the third largest host country of international migrants in 2015. In 2018, 565,684 immigrants came to Russia, and 510,993 of them were from the member countries of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, which consists of 11 former Soviet republics. In the migration policy of the Russian Federation, an emphasis is given on the integration of migrants. The immigrants are separated into two groups, Russian compatriots in Russian соотечественники and migrant workers from the CIS countries. The compatriots does not necessarily mean ethnic Russians, but these are people who are in close contact with the Russian traditions and native speakers or proficient learners of the Russian language. The government just need to support them to resettle in the regions in the Russian Federation. On the other hand, immigrants, especially from the member countries of the CIS, with a lower knowledge of the Russian language as compared to their predecessors. To support those immigrants, the Russian government plan to supply them with various types of assistance, including the courses of the Russian language, not only in the destination country, Russia, but also in their home countries. But as for children of migrants, there are certain measures that the government takes to provide them with education, especially education of Russian. It is obvious that not all migrant children fluently speak Russian. In 2015, there were 25,357 school children without this Russian citizenship in Moscow, including 4,907 from Ukraine, 3,128 from Kyrgyzstan, and 2,912 from Azerbaijan, and 2,739 from Moldova, and 2,400 and 51 from Armenia. The Russian language plays an important role in the linguistics integration of migrant children in the educational institutions. Except the schools with an ethnic component, in public schools, all subjects are taught in Russian. However, not all migrant children can speak Russian when they enter the local public schools. The most obvious problem in the first educational process is their lack of knowledge of Russian. Based on 2018 survey data, not only the children from far abroad, but also from the CIS countries like Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan experience the problems related to non-acquaintance of Russian in schools. Other students from Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova come to the Russian Federation with knowledge of Russian because in those countries, Russian is frequently spoken as a native language or in addition to the native language of the titular nation of the Republic. But the children from Caucasus and Central Asia sometimes come to Russia and are quite acquainted with Russian depending on their hometowns and social status of their parents. According to Demitseva, Zelenova, Kosmidis, Oparin, the informed students from abroad mentioned the first year in the Russian school as one of the hardest periods. Going to school together with Russian students, they get behind on the educational program because they don't always understand what happens around them. After the first year in school education, the children begin to speak Russian. In 2006, the Board of Education of Moscow published the order about the creation of Russian language school, in Russian Школа русского языка, as a subdivision inside the ordinary school to provide non-Russian speaking migrant children with Russian courses. Some of such schools accept children for free. The Department of UNESCO International Multicultural Education and the International Multicultural Education and Integration of Migrant Children in School of Moscow Institute of Open Education and the Center of Assistance for International Education called Ethnosfera were engaged in methodological support and lectured teachers and co-workers on work with children without the Russian citizenship. In 2013 and 2014 academic year, 18 groups of Russian language schools worked in 7 educational institutions where 262 children learned Russian. However, after the reform of education in Moscow, especially a change in funding of schools from funding based on expenditure of each school to funding based on the number of students in school, the situation got serious. In the beginning of 2016, there were only 5 Russian language schools, and 2 of those schools accepted migrant children for free. And in 2016-2017 academic year, 1 Russian language school was run based on fees from migrant parents. The lack of knowledge of Russian causes some problems in the process of acceptance of these children. In some cases, principals of schools refuse to accept migrant children under the pretext of the children's lack of knowledge of Russian. They're recommended to study Russian by themselves. In addition to this, there are some students who study in classes inappropriate for their age. their non-acquaintance of Russian prevents them to move up to the next grade. In the ordinary public schools, there is little support for school administrators and teachers. A great burden is imposed on teachers in ordinary schools. School teachers are not used to teaching migrant children. And there is a lack of teaching methods of Russian as a foreign language. As teachers in local schools need to cope with migrant students, they try to spend time for additional classes with those students. According to Demitseva Zelenova Kosmidis, in some schools, hours of circle activities are spared for additional classes of the Russian language. But in any case, local schools have neither preparation for appropriate instructional delivery nor availability of the required educational materials for migrant students. Teachers don't have any specially planned programs for them. Voluntary support. Outside public schools, there are some organizations that open charity Russian courses for migrant children. For example, the Embassy of Kyrgyzstan and the Russian Orthodox Church. In 2019, the Kyrgyz Embassy in Moscow, together with the government of Moscow, opened a school for migrant children from Kyrgyzstan. The school is to help migrant children to learn Russian for the entrance to local schools and to ease the burden on young Kyrgyz workers with children. In school, volunteers and students of the Russian University of Friendship of Peoples and the Moscow State University work as teachers. In the same year, the Russian Orthodox Church, supported by the Center of Assistance of Immigrants called Ryadom Dom, opened a school for migrant children. At the time, 16 children in 3 groups were learning Russian to prepare for the entrance to local schools. The school was planning to create a group for graduation exam from high school, called in Russian EG, and a charity kindergarten. It's obvious that the number of subdivision of Russian language school in public schools is decreasing. On the other hand, the number of immigrants is increasing in the whole country. Therefore, a great burden is imposed on teachers and school administrators in ordinary public schools. The refusal of school principals to accept non-Russian speaking children and to move them up to the next grade is the typical problem in the process of the linguistic integration of migrant children. Responding to the demands of Russian courses for migrant children, some organizations created voluntarily schools for them. The cooperation of the home country and the destination country in the field of the language education for migrant children, like the example of the Embassy of Kyrgyzstan, should realize the fundamental conditions to ensure the right to the education. The activity of the Russian Orthodox Church shows the importance of meeting the needs of migrant children from preschoolers to students preparing to enter the Russian universities. To ease the burden on local teachers, the Board of Education need to introduce additional methodological courses for local teachers to teach effectively migrant children and provide local schools with appropriate instructional materials for them. As Arefiev suggested in his paper, it is also necessary to introduce a mandatory test to assess knowledge of Russian of migrant children. In addition to his suggestion, it is important to create preparative Russian courses like Russian language schools within the ordinary schools and to direct the migrant children to a proper course based on the result of the test. They also The authorities also need to cooperate with other organizations which support migrant children in order to reduce barriers to entry to local schools, but should not depend too deeply on voluntary activities of public schools and non-government organizations. The linguistic integration should meet the needs of migrant children and relieve the anxiety of their parents in order to realize the integration of them with local Russian school children. In conclusion, Russia has been one of the largest host country for years. The number of the migrant children is increasing according to the increase of the immigrants to Russia. In Moscow, the Board of Education was created Russian language schools as sub-additional institutions within the ordinary public schools. Russian language schools cooperate with the Moscow Institute of Education and the non-commercial organization Ethno-Sphere. However, after the reform of education, the number of Russian language schools is decreased. Decreased. As a consequence of the reform, teachers and school administrators face the problems related to the lack of preparation for instruction delivery and of availability of educational materials for migrant children. On the other hand, some organizations, including the embassy supported by the local authorities, provide migrant children with voluntary Russian courses. It seems that the local authorities depend on such voluntary activities in the field of language education. The government of Moscow should take the initiative to solve the problem of the linguistic integration of migrant children in public school. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you, Takahiro. I think Shirley will take over.
Okay, thank you very much, Aryan and team, Ron, and all Aryan's students. It's already 5:11. I hope you still have time for QA. Okay, may I just announce that at the end of the lecture, I'll be posting in the chat box the link to the PDF presentation of Aryan, just Aryan's PDF presentation, and also the link to the e-certificate. Okay. We can accommodate just a few questions. I'd like to start off with the question of Dr. Aldrin Pili. Okay. To save time, let's not anymore call on Aldrin. So I'll just read the question. So this is the question of Aldrin Lee. So how is migration linguistics different from contact linguistics in terms of 1, phenomena being investigated, and 2, empirical or theoretical framework used for analysis? Note that contact linguistics also espouses an interdisciplinary approach and recognizes distinction between factors, internal and external, to the language. Dr. Bolangan?
Okay, thank you very much for the question, Dr. Lee. That was that's nice because it's, you know, it's, I mean, at the beginning of something like this, it's important to ask questions like, how is it different from that? How but also it must be, I want to point out that it's not necessary to make these very clear distinction that, oh, this is contact linguistics, this is migration linguistics. After all, half of the variables I've mentioned in migration language would have to be dealt with by contact linguistics. So that is one thing that we should also take note of. So it's not, if at all, I think for most of the time, migration, contact linguistics would focus on the structure, and there are many other things that migration linguistics would want to deal with. For example, I talk about the econometric modeling, which I think contact linguistics won't deal with, and they probably won't care whether other aspects would, you know, be taken into account. I think it's very structural for contact linguistics. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bolongan. I hope Dr. Lee is happy with the answer. Can I read two more?
I think
Yes.
it's 6:14 in Tokyo time.
Oh, I'd like to just mention that Professor Maya David shared that she appreciates that your students share their own research and they come from different countries. That's an excellent way actually of bringing together all these budding scholars. Okay, can we have one more? Just one more.
Sure.
Okay, this is coming from Miss Ayat Ferrios, a PhD student from the LSU. Hi, Dr. Bolangan. Thank you for such an informative discussion. First off, I'd like to say that migration linguistics is a rich addition to the growing body of linguistics. It's interesting to see the evolution of identity, culture, and correspondingly the language of migrants. But from the lens of someone like myself, who serves the National Office of the Philippines Department of Education and may have the opportunity to serve as an agent of change. How will this body of knowledge contribute to enhancing the language learning process? And what are the educational implications of findings in this field?
Oh, I think I think one strand we mentioned earlier was development of language programs. Specifically for the Philippines, I don't think we have a program for integrating migrants. Only the universities have these programs, language programs, dealing with students who come from foreign countries. I know LaSalle has that. But also because we're more of a sending country than a receiving country, I think that's why the government has not thought about these things. But probably later on we will have to deal with this when migration to the Philippines would increase. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Bolongan. I'm afraid we cannot accommodate more questions. It's 5:16 and we promised to end the meeting at 5 o'clock, okay? I requested Aryan not to end the meeting yet so that I can post later on the link to the auto-generated certificate and also the link to the PDF presentation of Aryan. But at this point, I'd like to, okay, I'm trying to open the, can you, I'd like to share also, I'd like to award a certificate of appreciation to the speaker. It will take some time. I'm trying to do the one, Aryan. I'm trying to share my desktop. Okay. Oh, okay. So you've just seen that I have a lot on my desktop actually. I don't know if that's what you see at the moment, okay? Dr. Aldrin Pili, you there? Kindly read the citation for Dr. Bolongan's, for the certificate of appreciation of Dr. Bolongan. Dr. Lee? Okay. Okay, looks like Dr. Lee is not here. So let me read the citation. The Linguistic Society of the Philippines, LSP, and the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies present this certificate of appreciation to Dr. Aryan Bolongan for conducting a lecture seminar on introducing migration linguistics held on July 25, 2020, 3 p.m. onwards via Zoom. Signed, Dr. Alejandro S. Bernardo, the President of the Linguistic Society of the Philippines. So on behalf of LSP again, thank you very much, Dr. Bolongan, Dr. Bilog, and Dr. Bolongan's students, okay, for the amazing work on linguistics. I'd like to thank your students. I cannot mention all the names, okay, for joining today's webinar. It's actually
very much
exciting to see young, I would say, budding linguists, young linguists, participating early in this kind of educational space. Okay, we hope to see
countries too.
Yeah, okay, Filipinos doing the same too. Okay. Can we have first, before we end, I'll be sharing later on, just give me time. Can we have first the usual, okay, picture taking, as you may know, okay. We cannot afford to miss that one. Yeah. Okay, I'm putting on, we have already activated, you can switch on your video so we can see who is behind the names. Also, I'd like to take this opportunity to instruct everyone. the next time that we have a webinar, please do, okay, modify your names. It's just this particular webinar that we have not actually activated the enable waiting room, okay? But in the next webinars, we will not accept any more gadget names, nicknames, just first names, or the names that are not valid. Okay, we'll start with the picture taking. I'm on the first screen. Takatsuki, are you there? You might want to turn on your video. Rex Lim also. Okay, yeah, I usually call on names. Okay, start. 1, 2, 3. Wait, I cannot see. Okay, one more time. 1, 2, 3. Okay, next screen. I'd like to acknowledge some friends sent me. So we also have participants actually from Taiwan. We have participants from, okay, that's Dr. Aiden Ye there, Japan, of course, Jim. We have from Australia, Loy Lising. We also have from Hawaii, Francis. And dami nag-message sa akin. Sabi nila, you did not mention our country. I apologize, okay? So 1, 2, 3. Okay, next. Okay, good to see warm bodies behind the cameras. 1, 2, 3. You're all smiling. Great. Good. Okay. 1, 2, 3. I also would like to explain the untoward incident that just happened. Please do not hate Miss the female Filipino name. Okay, the name was just copied. That was not Miss Priscilla. Okay, so she was trying to explain to me in the chat box that she was not the one who wrote all those cuss words, and we understand that, okay? Her name was just copied. Please do not hate her for that. But the two infiltrators are apparently foreigners and then just left the meeting right after the incident. We apologize for that, okay? And that's the reason why I always tell the participants to use their full names as Zoom IDs. Okay, we did not activate the waiting room. That's why that happened. But in the next webinars to come, I will not accept Zoom IDs with gadget names, nicknames, or names that are not legitimate. Okay, I'm still taking pictures. I'm now on the screen, 10th screen. Great to see people still smiling. Okay, please turn on your video if you're still there. I'm now on the 11th screen. There are 22 screens. Okay. Looks like this part, they are just IDs. So I have to stop taking pictures, okay? Or let me just do it for now. There are still people in this screen. I'm on the 40th screen. I'll do it very quickly. Okay. Okay, I got to stop since I don't see videos anymore. So at this point, I'd like to
send the link. Send the
I'm
link.
now sending the link. Okay. Wait, I'm doing it on my own. I'm sending the link to first the lecture. Okay, it's there. Okay, and now I'm sending the link to the automated, the auto-generate certificate. Please don't use caps lock. Okay, I repeat, don't use caps lock. Also, okay, no special request of link after the lecture, please. Okay, I have a lot of things to do, so I hope you understand. Okay. So I have just posted here the link to the e-certificate and the link to the PDF. If you are done filling out the form, you can leave the meeting. So again, I'd like to thank everyone who attended. We have around 557 who attended today's meeting. I'd like to thank again TUFS, the Dean, and the colleagues of Aryan who participated in today's lecture. And of course, to my good friend, excellent linguist, Dr. Aryan Borlongan, Ron, and the students. Okay, if you are done with the e-certificate, you may leave the meeting, okay? Also, please wait for the e-certificate. Okay, it will go to your inbox, but it might take time since there are more than 500 participants, okay? If it won't arrive in 10 minutes or so, please just wait. It will, yep, it will be sent to you in the inbox automatically. No, so no need to email me or to send me a private message just to ask for your e-certificate if you don't find them in your inbox in like 5 minutes or so. Okay, I'm trying to resend again the link. You may scroll up to okay. You can also scroll up if you didn't get the link to the lecture. Okay.
I think I can tell my students, you can exit now. I'll send you a line message. You just read it. You can exit now. Thank you very much for your participation.
Who else is here? Okay, we can make Chica.
Thank you very much. Attention, Francis Dumanig, who helped me also a lot in getting the American participants here in this webinar. My German friends, yeah.
We have a lot of participants from India and from Pakistan, especially from India. Okay. Yeah. We have a lot from Pakistan too. Okay. Yeah. Hi, Nathaniel. We can see you. Is Q Dong still here online? Q, are you still here? I think he has left. Okay, whoever is the owner of iPhone, Zoom and iPhone, okay, I was supposed to remove you, but yeah, just for now. Please edit your username. Please use your full name as your Zoom ID. Next time around, I won't accept participants with gadget IDs as the Zoom names. Okay, I'll be away now. I mean, away from my laptop. Thank you, everyone.